Mr. Pavel, Director of Finance, will take it down.
And this is my board chair, Ms. McGill.
I'm Cindy Aller, Lexington City Schools, and I'm by myself because an illness hit, so I'll take notes.
Absolutely. Anyone else in the room?
Yeah, I'm Pete Johnson, Jackson Bath County Schools. This is Jeff Wallace, County Commissioner, and our Superintendent, Dr. Martin King, will be here shortly. He'll drop his son off to school.
Understood. So on the screen now is the QR code. We are trying to make sure that we have all of you registered for this session. It should just be very quick. If you can pop out your phone and do that. I guess in the time of COVID, there is no sign-in sheet anymore. So I just want to say thank you again for being here. It looks like we have some full teams, and we also have some others who are doing some big representation for some of the groups that we will talk to today. But I definitely want to just begin by, I'll leave it up here a little bit longer, but we'll also put it up there again if you have not to get it recorded. Just want to let you all know that you all are our first. This is where we are kicking this off this week. We have 2 sessions today, here this morning and in Martin this afternoon, tomorrow in Cookeville and Cleveland, Thursday in Johnson City and Knoxville, and Friday in Dixon. And so lots of good conversations this week. And I know many of you either I've talked to directly. I know Megan McElroy, our Chief of Statewide Supports. Debbie Thompson has been, actually I've been more in West Tennessee. But we've had those individual conversations, and appreciate your participation in some of the town hall meetings. Really trying to make sure that with this group, as I shared in the email, that it really is about kind of being a little more specific about the state and local contribution component of this discussion. And so that is really the focus of today. I can't read this. Like, I don't know if this is an eye test, but absolutely we want to make sure that as we share in some of our other meetings with the town hall, that we are obviously excited to work with you on this opportunity, really working on the public funding formula for education. Before we begin, we need to remind you of the following: that conversations on this topic are not intended to reflect on the current BEP funding. The current formula will remain in place until a new funding formula is recommended and approved by the Tennessee General Assembly. That is their role in this process. The public is encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure that all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered as part of those decisions. Public comment is really encouraged to focus on developing a new formula rather than revisiting the current formula, considering what should be funded in the new formula and at what level. Subcommittees that are working on the 18 subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing all of that comment and making those recommendations and about what should be included in the new formula. While all committees, subcommittees, members of the public should feel free to communicate openly, documents and records may be subject to public inspection pursuant to the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be posted publicly otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but clearly not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the. So I've never had to read a disclaimer quite like that before, so thank you all for bearing with me as we walk through that. But the long and short is that all of these public meetings and all of these engagements, these are things that will inform decisions, and so certainly we encourage you to share with us on the email we'll review at the end, but also just know that they will be part of larger and other conversations in this process. So as we kick off today, this is kind of where we will go in the next couple of hours. We've done the first 2. We will give some information on the local funding overview and really spend the majority of time, as we have in all of these public meetings, hearing from you, getting feedback and questions from you regarding the state and local contribution component here. And so the majority of our time will be kind of through that process and discussion. And then, of course, feedback, sharing some feedback, what we are hearing in those conversations to date, as it relates to this, because I will say, and I know Sam could attest to as well, this is the question we're getting quite a bit about what this means for local communities and local funding bodies. And so, again, appreciate your time, appreciate your participation today. We will leave time at the end for questions and answers. But I will also say that this is the first of what we expect to be other engagement opportunities in January. This is just for us to begin those conversations and hear from you right now as where we are in the process. And so when we think about who is at the table today, and we look, as you listen to all of the folks who are represented in this room today, it's very intentional as we were talking about, you know, who all needs to be talking to each other and talking amongst their groups. And so we do have county commissioners, local funding entity representatives here in the room, and knowing that every district is set up maybe a little bit differently. We know that there are different structures and government structures. We also want to be sure that in instances that we have representatives from mayors, especially in some of our smaller districts, we know that there oftentimes are folks who wear many hats, but want to make sure that we have and don't exclude any mayors or other decision makers in those districts. School board chairs, we sent the list to all the chairs and said, hey, try to get someone here. If you're unable to be here as the board chair, please send some representation so that you all also can go back and share with your larger group. Of course, our directors of schools are going to anchor this now, of course, in the future. And then, of course, school finance directors, knowing that they are oftentimes the ones working most directly with our school district leaders in this work. This is really about making sure that as we have conversations about those local contributions, that really you all are best suited to help us get this right. There is a reason it hasn't been done in 30 years. It is hard work. It takes a village truly to make this happen. And so that is part of the reason we are initiating these conversations today, but look forward truly just to hearing from you all as we walk through this discussion. And when we link this back to our strategic plan, a lot of the work that I lead, a lot of the work that Sam leads kind of happens in the background, but is absolutely essential for all of the strategic priorities we have in our plan. It is foundational to the work we do, and it is necessary, knowing that I think back a decade of how the needs of students have changed in the last decade. Certainly the last 30 years, when I think back where I was 30 years ago and the way school was taught, equipment, opportunities, coursework, all of those things has certainly changed dramatically in 30 years. And really this process should help pose those questions and honestly force some decisions throughout the process to ensure that what we end up with at the end of all of this is something better for kids, something more that really helps fund what we need to be true in Tennessee for education. And so with that, I'm going to hand off to Sam. Welcome.
Can you guys hear me without the mic okay? It's good echo in this room. I figured avoid some of that back and forth. So I'm Sam Piercy, Deputy Commissioner of Operations, for those of you I haven't met. A few quick tidbits to start before we delve into this. I just want to note, for those of you who love and know her deeply, Marianne Dursky sends her best. Obviously one of our key experts in this field, and we were discussing a lot of the conversation last night, so she wanted me to say hello for everyone. We're going to jump into a quick overview of the funding formula, specifically as it pertains to the state local contribution section, which is the primary focus of today's discussion and what we want to get out of that. So I just want to set that up and sort of tease apart the conversation that's happening in the subcommittees and the public feedback about building the formula versus the piece that is, how do we determine the state's local shares of what funds go into the formula? So just kind of want to level set there from the front end here. Quick BEP overview for those of you who may have not seen the BEP Blue Book in a number of years or ever. It provides a basic level of funding for education. It has 47 different components spread across 4 different categories. As it pertains to local and state shares, each of those categories has a starting point break. So our instructional component, for example, is split 70-30 to start. 70% state funds, 30% local funds. Each of the 4 categories has their own unique breaking point. That is that starting point assumption. Ranges from 70-30 down to 50-50. Those divisions are then further adjusted to account for local capacity. So this is the part that is a very big driver of what locals end up putting in and what the state puts in. It's that local fiscal capacity piece. We'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. From there, local funds may be derived from property taxes, optional sales tax, wheel tax, investment income, other. This is the part of the work that you as county commissioners know extremely well, right? This is where the revenues have to come from to make up that local contribution side. So I do want to take just a second to hit on fiscal capacity, because it is the piece of the conversation around local contributions that matters the most. In short, it's the ability of a county to raise local taxes for education. Lots of mathematical formulas underneath that, but that is basically what the indicator is trying to get at. So those counties who have a higher fiscal capacity, that means the stronger ability to pay for education in their area, may pick up a higher share than those counties who have a lower fiscal capacity. I want to point out, it's not based on what is actually raised. It's a relative measure across the state. So if a locality has the ability to raise taxes based on property values, but opts not to, this isn't based on actual revenues that are generated, right? The formula determines each county's ability based on the average rates across the state. So again, we're trying to get relative indicators of fiscal capacity. I will point out, especially important for this room and our municipals who are present, it's determined at the county level, not at the individual district level. So as I know that I'm looking at some finance directors from the municipality, like that's a challenge, right? There's a disconnect there. We've got a measure that's based on a county level, and then we actually operate funding at the district levels. The last piece I'll note here is that the current BEP formula relies on a combination of 2 different fiscal capacity indicators, one from TASER and one from CBER. At the end of the day, that means that there's 2 different expert groups trying to come to a conclusion about fiscal capacity, and we weight both of those 50% each and combine them to multiply. What does that all generate for you, right? For those of you who are making budget decisions at the local level, you end up with basically 2 numbers that come out of all of this. The first is the required local match. So from all that formula piece that we've just done, what are locals required to put in for local education? That's the required match. It's totally tied to that formula of multiplying the basic splits against the fiscal capacity adjustment. The second piece that you will be familiar with, many of you, is the maintenance of effort requirement. This one is not tied directly to the formula itself, but exists elsewhere in state law. And the maintenance of effort requirement says that every locality has to budget as much as they did last year for public education. So for many counties and districts in the state, localities are making the decision and commitment to put in more to public education than the local required match. The maintenance of effort requirement says that unless for some reason your enrollment is dropping year over year, in which case you can adjust it, otherwise you must maintain the same level of funding you put in last year to your systems. This is going to connect some dots into where we're seeing. Again, we've got some slides at the end that will touch on a little bit of the broader feedback on the funding formula, but this piece is just narrowed in on how this local contributions piece is being heard from the field through town halls, many of which you all have attended and shared out. Based on feedback, we are proposing that we look at this as a 2-step process. The first step would be to develop the formula. The second step would be to come back over the next 12 months to determine an appropriate local contribution based on that new formula. So let me say this very clearly. It is very difficult for you all as local leaders to make an informed decision about what a local contribution calculation could look like if you don't know how much money is going in and how that formula is going to play out for your localities, right? We've heard it loud and clear. That makes very good sense. So this is the starting point recommendation. We're going to ask for your feedback, tear it apart, add to it during our discussion today. But this is where we are suggesting we start the conversation. We don't try to rush this moment of figuring out a different local contribution calculation. Instead, we focus right now on the funding formula itself, for the metaphor that lives on in infamy, building the pie, right? And then we give ourselves 12 months for everyone to have a really robust, engaged conversation around what could that mean for local contributions moving forward. So what would that mean? It would mean that local districts would see more state dollars in a new formula, but local communities would not have to contribute anything additional for at least 5 years. Again, starting point recommendation. Right, so for those of you who are concerned about having to make a change on July 1, that is not where we're starting this conversation, right? Point 2 here, the department is starting with a proposal of a 1-year discussion to develop the right local match proposal based on any new state funding and formula. And that gives a 4-year runway to implementation, right? So the things that we know are true, right? People, this is loud and clear, resonated in all the feedback. People want more money, they want to maintain flexibility, and they want time to execute this well. All reasonable things to come up in a funding conversation, right? So from the local contribution side, this is where we are suggesting we start the conversation today. What we want, and what we will delve into in the discussion section, is for you to partner with the other representatives of your area to help share feedback on this kind of starting point of the conversation. I'm going to pull Eve back up, but before we kind of transition to more of a discussion phase, if there are questions I can answer right now, happy to do that. We also have a question and answer period at the end. Any general questions on where we're starting with the local contribution side? Yes.
Sam, my understanding is that the governor and the CDOE would like the legislature to act on the new school funding formula in this next legislative session. And they have not wanted to draw that out. They're not saying don't rush this. They're saying we're going to rush this because we think that will make it successful, is what we're being told. But what I'm hearing you say, and that's new information to me, is that the local funding conversations would be stretched out over the course of a year. So am I understanding correctly that the legislature would possibly adopt a funding formula that only deals with the state contribution and not deal with the local contribution at all once that's adopted?
So Ted, I appreciate the question, and let me make sure that I do the ever appropriate caveat there, right? All of this depends on the General Assembly and how they tackle this topic. But the recommendation would be that, yes, we have an urgent need around the formula itself, getting more funds in public education. We know we can't make an informed decision about how local contributions play out without seeing that formula in action, right? So the proposal in that initial recommendation would be to say, why don't we consider a law that may introduce a new formula and describe how we go about tackling the local contribution over a period of time. Not necessarily having it ironed out, the same thing. Yes, sir.
It says local districts may see more state funding. Does that mean local districts may see less state funding?
What has been said multiple times throughout this process is that we have not seen a single state formula reform anywhere in the country that has been passed that each district didn't come out with additional funds. I think from a political lens, that's probably a non-starter for people.
So there will be a whole form that's in place.
Right. You'd be looking at what additional money the state is putting into this.
I think the concern that I had was the impetus for all this was sales tax. I've heard about the governor saying, hey, we've got this extra money, and that was the driving force to make greater investments in education. My concern now is that this is a completely different topic about portions of local funding versus state funding that does concern a lot of our municipal school districts, special school districts. That's my fear, is that we may see more funding, but you may put a much greater burden on our communities depending on how that formula is practiced. I think that's something we have to see what the plan is before we do.
Well, I think what we're inviting you to do here is be a part of that formulation, right? I agree with you. You can't make a decision on what the local contribution would be without having real numbers tied to it and what the formula looks like, right? That's what we want to ask you about today. What is a good approach for that side of the conversation, the local managements? Yes, sir.
I have the pleasure of serving both on the BEP committee and on TASC. I'm still concerned that we're going to try to do a state formula without the information, including the locals. Obviously, that's what's kept it so difficult. I've said that the BEP formula has been broken for years, but what are you using? What is your template for your state formula?
We honestly have been taking it straight from the subcommittee work. So we have 18 subcommittees representing different bodies of students, business needs, a plethora of different groups, rural communities, urban communities. And that's what we are taking to rebuild a formula around a student-based model. All right. Seeing no other questions, I'm going to ask that we go ahead and pivot into some discussion time. Yes, ma'am.
I was at a TOS meeting last week.
Yes.
Are we not, is the state not looking at Ohio, Maryland, and Texas as potential, formulas to build off of?
So I would say that we're looking at those
And
states.
I'm coming off of his question.
Yes. So we're looking at a lot of different states. Those are some of the key ones: Ohio, Maryland. We've looked at what's happening in Georgia. Anytime we're trying to do this kind of landscape analysis to help inform public conversation, we're going to look at states that look like Tennessee, states that are in the Southeast, right, and bring that information to the table. But I wouldn't say that we don't we're not trying to create. We're not trying to mirror someone else. We want to build this for Tennessee that works for Tennessee.
Just a follow-up to that, please. Ohio has the right as education districts to tax. They create their own tax. I don't suspect that'll pass. So I'm just interested in why we're using their formula, since we know we won't be able to do what they do.
Yeah, this is why we are not using their formula, right? We are looking at the tenets of models across the country to see what has worked and what hasn't, but we're not relying on anyone else's formula as our kind of base model to go from. That's coming straight from the subcommittee recommendation. All right, I want to pivot us to the discussion section. And so if we can take just a few minutes here, I recognize that some groups are a little bit split out. So if you can move your seats and sit with your regional groups, so anyone who's from your county commission or funding entity or mayor's office or representation with school districts, that would be great. So we'll give you a few minutes to shuffle seats. And yeah, please spread out. We have lots of space in this room.
All right, I'm going to try what Sam tried. I'm trying to do this without the microphone, bring my teacher voice back a little bit. But so the way we're going to structure the next section here of the presentation this morning in our time is to really do just that. Give you time to have some discussions within your teams, and then we're going to report out to the group so that we can take your feedback. Because I oftentimes think that you will learn most by things that you hear from others. And so part of what we're trying to do is, as Sam said, thinking about what a process could look like. So we have 3 discussion questions. This is the first one that says within your team, discuss or report feedback on the process you would like to see to determine local contribution. And so I threw some things up there just as considerations. This is not intended to be a limited list, but something just to kind of pique your and kind of start your conversations. And that would be things like if this were to become a 1-year process to develop this local contribution, what is the meeting cadence and frequency? Who's involved, the structure, accountability, and then what's the backstop if nothing can be reached? So thinking through those key things, we will give you probably 10 to 15 minutes. I'll just kind of pay attention to where the groups are, but you'll also want to choose that lucky person that will get to report it out to the group so we can record your feedback. Any questions on that before we get started? So again, this first one is just about process, about how we would go about developing the local contribution component. Are we good on that? All right, well, I will let you all get started and we will be kind of rotating. But I also encourage you, it's really tight, especially trying to hear each other. Certainly there is room at the front as always, if you want to spread your team out a bit.
Yeah, and I see some districts that go to other districts, so they just yeah, but we're learning from this. We're just and I'll do the same.
So on that line, here's the group right here. How often do you help how long? We have 12 months. 12 months. How often? Twice a month. Now, who gets the money? You're sitting here looking at it. But you only had you've got 7 mayors. You're gonna have 7 municipal private financials. You're gonna have 7 superintendents. 7 school finance directors. How you gonna have those meetings? Are you zooming or you are and you also probably need to be wary of sunshine so you can talk to them. So you don't have county mayor obviously county finance person. But if you have in our more than one county commissioner, then you've got to have sunshine. School board chair. I'm gonna try to bring the school side. I'm bringing everything to go again. All right, now. In other words, like the other side of the wall, that would be. Just wait a minute. That's for your individual.
the subcommittee meeting, they're going to be wrapped up. There's not cars somewhere. We don't talk about that.
Local, 5 years or local. And then department, 1 year discussion. And an additional 4-year roadway. We've got 12 months. Now, we'll go back and pull that. Bring it all in. So, without breaking the participants down, my time. School district, director, designee, board chair, and CFO. County side, the mayor and the chief financial officer. And from each 6 municipalities, a mayor and the designee and the chief financial officer. So a county administrator, what about a governing body, county commission, all. Mayor and city line. Once a month, and now it's changed. Type it all out. We're already down to the last, we that's going to be open Thursday. And I heard that we don't have our designate this think our view is more unique than anybody else's.
Okay, so we're gonna let you all have the next minute to wrap up your conversations, and then we're gonna begin to share out. So if you've not selected that person that needs to share feedback for your group, you can do that now as well. We'll give you a minute to wrap, and then we're gonna start sharing out.
Judy wants to know if we can put an EAMS 2.0 blurb in the CUFD. And I don't even know if that makes sense because especially if, so this is really where we wanted to share out. Yeah.
Okay. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started with sharing out. We will be kind of at a high level recording the group's feedback. I do want to say thank you all for the discussion. As I shared before this question, all right, so thank you all again for the discussions in your groups. I know there's a lot to talk about, but I want to make sure we get to all of the questions. And what I hope that you all will do is, and certainly you don't have to share out every sidebar or every discussion that you had, but if each group would be willing to share a couple of the takeaways related to this first kind of operationalize, how do we operationalize a process over the next 12 months to do this. We're actually going to start in the back corner. Cindy, you're up.
Cindy.
Okay, so we're going to start at the back and work up this side and then down that side just to shake it up a bit. All right, so if you all will give Cindy your attention.
Yes, everybody give me your attention. I love being there with you. Well, you know, in looking at all of this, you know, things that are gonna come up with participants was the first thing we thought of. We don't just need us there, and we don't just need our board members there. We're gonna have politicians there, because you all know what's gonna happen as soon as they see that we're getting more money, because maintenance of effort is not just gonna say they can't go down. They're also gonna look at that as we don't have to go up. This is where we're at. And then we got into, we don't really like the terminology maintenance of effort in a local area, because not that everybody would, but some people look at that as, well, that's what we have to give, and we don't have to go above it either. We can't go below it, we don't have to go above it. So we feel like that's kind of shooting ourselves in the foot. What else am I going with?
We said the participants, as far as when you try to get together, you probably try to group school systems of the same size and the same demographics together and compare those, once you have that breakdown to bring back together as well.
So a couple of the things flagging there, knowing that positions change, people in different roles change. So how do we, if we establish a process, who needs to be part of that process, and knowing that people could change roles during that period of time, but also making sure that we have groups that represent different size and demographics of whether it's rural, suburban, urban. We talked a little bit also about, thinking about our city systems, municipal districts, and do we group them in that way? That was some of the discussion that I heard in that group as well. If nothing else to add, if we could grab the next group here in the back.
Well, we talked about a lot of other things too. I know we've seen a little different than what they're thinking, but I do think, I don't know if this fits under accountability, but there are parts of the BDP, in my opinion, just listening, that superintendents and school districts feel like that we shouldn't throw away. I mean, there's some components to that. I think the part that's going to be so difficult, one of the things that we discussed, is that every district is different. Every funding body is different. There are ideas and thoughts about, some districts can lose ADM, and man, we want to make sure we can take every red cent, and we'll split a penny if we have to get it back. Our county mayor, Kathy Michigan, be good to say, we know you still have to operate the same number of schools, although you've lost a little enrollment. We're going to let you keep the same amount of funding. So each context is different. So I think you're going to have to use some components of the BDP formula, like the fiscal capacity index or something similar, to determine that. If you start trying to make it, I think we're going to be all over the place if we start trying to make it something different than what that is.
So just kind of summarizing, making sure that we are also mindful that there are components that are in the current formula that doesn't just need to be abandoned when we think about how we think about fiscal capacity. I think that's a really valid point, and something we also know that will be part of that. Yes, sir.
We'll make a couple of comments from the mayor's side. We talk about meeting frequency. We know it's going to be pretty much the same statistics, the structures, accountability, and process. No decision can be reached. Now, a couple of things. We're a distressed county. Our population is a little bit older than a lot of counties. Our population, the income level is a lot lower than a lot of counties. So, as a mayor, and as other mayors know, property tax is our #1 source of revenue. Well, we can't put an undue burden on the citizens by raising property tax, we increase more funding, going to those. So first of all, you're going to have to look, as Mr. Kimball said, at each different district that's out there. But I worry that the process to no decision, are we going to get closer to the end? Is that going to open us up to lawsuits because the state says, okay, this is on you, you do this. So we're fighting, the county government is fighting with the school district over the funding process of what that may look. So there's a lot of context that's really got to be taken in this process. And, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So when you start changing this, there's going to be consequences. And I think our thing is, we feel in the rural areas that we have always been overlooked when it comes to education, funding, and all those things that go along in the urban and metropolitan areas. So there's got to be a strong focus on that. And I think the majority of mayors and superintendents here are from rural areas that struggle with a lot of these same scenarios.
I appreciate those comments, and I do think it speaks to how we think about fiscal capacity, not just what you're contributing, but what is your ability, as you just described about the property taxes being the primary sources that way in a lot of our districts. And I've shared this with some others. We have 146 districts. We have over 90 that serve fewer than 5,000 students. So we have lots of, we have some larger systems, but we certainly have a lot of smaller systems. We also have very rural systems that are part of that, but also there are some other considerations around proximity and access that have to be part of that discussion. But I think your point, both of your points about fiscal capacity will certainly need to be part of the ongoing discussion as we think about kind of, if we take a year to do this well, once we get a little more information about the actual formula, and then think about a 4-year period in which we would talk about how do you ramp up and implement. I was hoping that to get also some thoughts about, is that the appropriate amount of time to do that? That actually might be the next part of the future question. Yes, sir.
On this last point I want to make, this is my opinion, but I think for the record, if everyone feels the same, I feel like in discussions I have with many of my colleagues, that the process is too rushed. The process to change the formula to do it this cycle for the legislature is too rushed. And and we need to be having these levels of conversations with the state formula and the local formula over the next year or so until we can get it right. I think it's rushed.
Yes, agreed. Thank you for that, and we'll note that also, and take that back as well. Next group coming up, Troy, I see you sitting back there. Can you all share out some high-level feedback from your group?
Yes, and Steve, thanks for the opportunity to share. And again, I'm trying to immerse myself in as much knowledge as I can, but I am speaking mostly, like I mentioned to Trudy, speaking out of ignorance. You know, as far as the questions, we can do like what the mayor and Sean has said behind us. We can answer some of these questions probably similar about who would participate. But as far as some of the identifiers, just like you said, describing a good plan or the right plan, there still needs to be, for me personally, a learning curve that needs to have a greater context, because I haven't studied these other state plans. I understand the premise of having more opportunities for some students to have more funding contributed to them individually, because some students require more to have a least restrictive environment in their learning path. However, to say that I have all this knowledge and can stand on the platform and be able to echo what needs to happen, and then for me as a local leader to be able to say to my group, that's a good plan, I'm still limited with that knowledge.
Understood, and I think that's why we were trying to know that this is actually just the first of what we expect to be additional opportunities to have these kinds of discussions, because I think what you all are voicing is the challenge that we have here is that it's not, especially when you're talking about folks who aren't doing this day in, day out like you all are, and superintendents, CFOs, et cetera. Making sure that you are creating a base of understanding so that everyone's kind of starting with at least a level of understanding in what needs to be present or true in a formula. So I think one of the things I would also like to hear, either, I know it'll be on a feedback form at the end, or what else do you need? And so that'll be part of what we were talking about, and trying to be as specific as possible about what those things are, so that we can help and kind of facilitate future discussions so we can meet your needs in those future conversations. So I appreciate that.
Well, I would just say also, and again, I know that I asked Steve, my patriarch friend here, when you see that we might have greater increases, the slide shows we might have increases in the state funding. I know how the BEP is, and of course, that's all I've ever known is the BEP. So for every one, if Henderson County finds more funds, then that could be that Chester is not. So it's still the piece of pie. You know, you've got one pie, and everybody's slice is going to be adjusted accordingly. So that's, again, it's hard for me to get outside at a different view to look at this in a novel way, other than what I've already experienced.
And Sam noted this at the beginning, but one of the premises that we were operating from is that this will be more money. And so, you know, the pie is not going to remain the same size. So the pie would get bigger, and certainly to your point, sliced differently based on the formula itself and you know, what students need to be successful, and where, you know, what that would look like with the base and the student weights that are associated with that. So I definitely think the more information that we have from this group about what else is needed will be valuable, knowing that this is, again, just the first of the conversations to come on this very important topic of conversation. Appreciate that. Next group coming up, any feedback from the next group?
Nothing really to add, other than Steve said, good to see Dr. Keating make his we all have to introduce ourselves. Do want to say we do need to meet frequently on this because of the time frame. As Steve said, bring players to the table that are going to have a we've worked to have Representative Bird and Senator Law and others that have been very good to us to keep us informed, and we will start tonight.
Thank you for that. Next group.
Yeah, I could just make two quick points. One is the 12-month time frame. You realize in September 2022, over 50% of the Carroll County Commission will be gone. They're retiring. So you've got the Carroll County Commission, you've got mayors that are retiring at the end of that period. So I think it goes back to the point we're rushing. We need the time, but if we're going to create a crisis of participants knowing their role, school board members may be gone. We're special school districts, so we're okay.
Sure.
The other thing I would say is communication from the state has to step up 2 or 3 notches. I mean, I'll be honest, I'm sitting down here and I think you've got 18 little vaults. Because we got a subcommittee here, we got a subcommittee. I don't know what those subcommittees are doing. I have a full-time job. I get 0 pay to be a board member. 0 pay to be a board member. I don't have time to go track down every meeting you've got going on. There's got to be better communication coming from the state.
I appreciate that and note that. I know the subcommittees, we can certainly take that back because there should be an opportunity to share out some of that work as it's continuing to move forward. But appreciate the comments. I would say about the turnover, that was one of the comments that I was thinking about on the participants, knowing that there will always be people moving out of certain roles and into new roles at different times. And so how do we keep some kind of, if we're thinking about a process over 12 months to do something, making sure that we're engaging, but also knowing that you have to account for changes in positions, retirements, other folks coming into these conversations. So definitely appreciate the call out there and want to make sure we take that into account. I was going to go to Joey next, but he's doing a sidebar. So. Hey, I'm just kidding.
Okay.
Oh, yes.
I'll intro it. What had already been said, I'm sure Joey will finish just here in a minute. But I did want to say a couple things. Number one, when it talks about local, we don't have a problem. Locally, planning all this out on how to discuss this locally, we don't need to do that. We have a great relationship with our local finance, and that's really not going to be an issue for us. That's fine. Our issue is more with what the state piece is going to look like, because that's going to impact so much more than what this is going to impact. And we need to know, when it talks about discussing, we don't know what to discuss. That's what they were bringing up back there, is we have to have more information before we know what to discuss. I wasn't a big proponent of changing the BEP anyway. I wanted the pie bigger, like you mentioned earlier, and then let us keep tweaking it. This whole part about growing the BEP, the superintendents weren't for that anyway. That was told to us. We didn't want to do that to begin with. So we're trying to figure out how we're going to make that work. And planning is going to be a big deal. When we talk about what our enrollment's going to look like and how you project what those numbers are going to be, everything's a year in the rear now. But now we're going to have to turn around and figure out. That's going to be a big piece. That's going to be a lot bigger piece to discuss, I think, than this local piece is going to be. At least for our county. So, Joey.
Thank you.
Well, and two, the locals are going to have to figure out their piece no matter what. We just got to know what the state's going to do. To me, if we're having a backing discussion before anything starts, and we really need answers from the state on this. That's critical. We can't address the local needs until we know that.
And so to that point, that is actually why we kind of were intentional about having this conversation on a little bit on the front end, because what we need to stand ready to do is that as our subcommittees move forward, as the General Assembly moves forward, and this, if they present a proposal, it is passed, we need to hit the ground running at that moment. And so that is part of the reason for the pre-planning right now, because what we don't want is to be scrambling on the back, once it's passed, we want to stand ready and know that we have a process in place to do this and do it well, and to have the right people and to have the right conversations, and be able to help by running models once we have that state formula set. So flagging that, but also knowing that this is also just about trying to get your input on what a year-long planning process for this component could and should look like. So appreciate the comments.
For us, the fiscal capacity conversation was
similar to what everyone said. And we are fortunate that our county commission supports us, and that's the experience I have in Lauderdale and Lake. I think the consistent piece here, the piece that's missing, and we've talked about it, and we saw it with the ESA. We had a state representative who told our school board he would not vote for vouchers. And I know that vouchers is not the conversation, but we need to know the history, and we need to know the story. And we need to know the history of public education, and we need to know why we will disperse student amount so that we might be able to do something with it in a couple of years in way of choice. And local politicians, like local politics is the way to go. And what happened with the voucher bill is our representative got up there, felt pressure from the Speaker of the House who held the floor open, and it flipped the vote. So if we want hard participants and accountability, our state representatives and our state senators need to be at the table with us, and we need to hold them accountable. Because if we let the commissioner, and I also respect the commissioner, or if we let the governor's office control this narrative, our state representatives will fold when they get to national. It is so clear. Folks, this can change the whole focus of Tennessee. Look at Ohio, look at Indiana, look at what's happening in New Hampshire. Like, know our history. Public education is in the state constitution of every state in the nation, and it happened after Reconstruction. We're about to embark on something that's going to blow up Tennessee to the 95 counties if we don't hold folks accountable. I'm sick and tired of national politics controlling the dynamics in Tennessee. We need to focus on children in Haywood County. I don't give a shit about kids in North Carolina or Ohio. I do, but like we have got to get real about this stuff. We are being, they are rolling over us and we're taking it. So, and I'm sorry to be so freaking passionate, but we have got to stop. You don't have time because you have a job, but my peers, folks, we need to stop playing nice and hold us accountable. I can like you, I respect you, but I can hold you accountable, by knowing what I need to know to ask questions. Folks, we're on a pathway that's going to set us up. I mean, some of you may be retired and don't care. I have a grandson that's 6 years old. Look at the history. Public education's been in thought since the Northwest Ordinance. John Adams, Thomas Jefferson. Like, do your research. Look at what's happening in our state. Look and see what's happening. We're in trouble. We're in trouble. We don't hold Representative Hart and Wally and Jackson and Todd and those folks accountable. We're in trouble. We are in trouble. You may not agree, but how many people in this room want vouchers in the state of Tennessee? How many people in this room? That needs to be a message that goes back to the governor's office. Like, I don't know anyone in this room that thinks school choice is a wise idea for rural communities. Yeah, that's going to be part of the conversation, and not from the department, but just from what we're seeing unfold from the national politics, the code. Just look at it. It's not conspiracy theory. It's not the mess that we're dealing with the election. Like, this is real stuff, and we can roll over and let them control our local communities. Because, and this is my last comment, in Haywood County, we are not an employment agency. And folks in this room know that I fired lots of folks. We are not an employment agency. But we are the number 2 employer in Haywood County. We drive economics in our communities. And if we don't send folks to Nashville that will stand up for our local community, that economic barrier can be destroyed and we're all in trouble. Now, I may be out tomorrow because of my Here's the thing, like, I'm not going down that fight. Because if we don't fight, we have screwed our communities. So it's time to say, vouchers, fund our schools, make the pie bigger, and let's really get about kids and stop the national narrative that focus on Tennessee. Otherwise, let's just roll over, let them do what they want to do. All right, thank you. I'm sorry.
Let me just say one thing.
Yes, sir. Yes, Yes, sir.
I think we got skipped over, but I just want to make one comment about the structure and participants. We need to follow the governor's lead on the summits he's been having. The best meetings we've had with distressed or at-risk counties. You put us together because it is different, board education and everything else. But at that meeting, I mean, we're having team meetings, we don't have the team here. You know, at the governor's conference, we had the legislators sitting at the room, at the table. We had the commissioners sitting at the table. So we had all the decision makers. And I think we're wasting our time if we don't have something like that. And you can break it down into categories. But we got to have those people there. And Dr. Smith, maybe have some comments in our group.
I'm a little weird, Mr. Davis over here. With the rural and distressed counties, it is different. We talk about property and sales tax and how we are just limited as it is with even future plans and possibilities for our students. But it's really hard for us to sit here and have conversations when we don't understand the state level to even begin to love the contribution when everyone else is talking about as well.
Thank you both. I didn't mean to skip you, my apologies. Up here in the front. I know there was like a super group over here.
We're in the super groups, yeah.
Okay, so.
We pulled everybody together from Shelby County and the 6 municipalities and somehow ended up being the reporter. As you can imagine, and I know it was shot going in the room, there was not a lot of decisions made with that super group. But we tried to follow this process. Vincent, we let him come in from Fayette, and after the meeting, he said, I'm going back to Fayette. I keep following Joey, but I think the overlying theme here of meeting frequency, we went around the world on this, and I think we finally settled on maybe once a month. All meetings other people have. The participants, we started with a representative from the county level and every school district level and every municipality level funding, and then we quickly realized that's going to be about 50 people in a meeting, not very productive. So I think we laid it on before we broke up, maybe a representative from each entity to pull together if a meeting was being had. I think structure in person, if that's the question you're looking at, obviously, I think that's the answer. Accountability and process, not real sure, but I think everybody has said it. It's hard for the people to meet together and have an agenda unless they have some idea what state piece is. So there's really nothing to talk about until they know the numbers. So.
And to that, I think a couple of things you flagged on, I just wanted to circle back on around structure and accountability. Part of when Sam and I were talking about this initial meeting versus, potentially a follow-up meeting in January, is it a work session? Is it an information session? So some of that is like, what does it look like once we get more information on the components of the formula? Thinking about the structure. The other thing I should have put on the slide was, like, it kind of speaks a little bit to accountability, but what is the feedback loop? So when those representatives go back, how do we address the communication challenge of making sure that everyone has the information and are receiving updates on where things are within that kind of year of planning? So I think that's part of what we're talking about here as well, is making sure that this is not happening in a vacuum over here, and I don't know where we are in that process. I think they're meeting, we want to move past that and make sure that as we develop a structure to do this well, that we are also thinking about what does the loop back to other stakeholders look like, and how do we do that in a way so we don't have those big gaps in communication. Sorry, Gary.
You're good. So the local match and the state contribution are so interconnected. I'm having trouble really coming to terms with the thought that we would try to push through part of it without knowing the other part, without knowing the local match. And there's so many questions about it as far as would it continue to use Taxer or Receiver Fox? Would it still be a 50-50 split? Would there be the cost differential factor or not? It's really hard to make those decisions. And I think the narrative for the state portion of the money is an easier sale, because what we've all heard is regardless of how it works out, everybody's getting more money. Well, it's hard to push back and say, no, let's not do something that will give us more funding on that. But just because the state has a big bucket of money to throw out, which is great, it's needed, that doesn't mean that the locals do. So my fear is that the local portion, depending upon how the formula goes, that's going to have some radical implications for the local formulas. And you said that, hey, we don't have a template for it. My suggestion would be come up with some template options. Let's plug them into spreadsheets and see what it means for our localities, so that we can make better decisions about we like this or we don't like this, we support this or we don't support that. But I don't know how you break that apart.
I appreciate that, and I would say also just part of what we expect would be those spreadsheets, and that to me feels like the next step in this process once some of those other decisions are made. But I certainly understand that and acknowledge that this is a difficult conversation until we get that other component. Own that and understand that. But really, again, trying to make sure that we are thinking about what does that look like. And part of that year-long decision would be, does it continue to be a 50-50 Seabrook task split? Like, those are the things that the process will determine over a period of that year of planning. So I appreciate the flag and would capture that. Yes, sir.
To follow up on Superintendent Bailey County's comments, we're losing representation in this last census. Shelby County is going to lose a House member, and rural West Tennessee is going to lose a House member. Same thing over in East Tennessee. Middle Tennessee, they pick up that power in the House and the Senate. So it's important that you not just make a relationship with your representative, but that you make you band together and go in and visit with them. And I don't want to say make them get to know you, but make it where they want to get to know you so that they can understand what's happening in your community. Because if you don't, there's more and more urban representatives. And if you don't get these rural to understand the importance of them banding together, the rural counties, they won't see much difference, I don't think. Not enough to make it where people are going to move in because of the education process.
Yeah, I appreciate that and understand what you just described as a great call out. I think what we know, and I'm looking at Haywood, thinking about, things that are coming their way, it look very different in other parts of the state, and so we understand that can be part of it. I will say to the rural piece, every single conversation I have been involved in has had that call out to acknowledge the challenges, the differences from the tax base, the ability to raise revenue, all of those things have absolutely been in every single conversation that I have been part of in this conversation. So while I hear you and understand that is the way our state General Assembly legislature representation works, it is absolutely front of mind for the governor, the commissioner, our teams. My teams work very closely with many of every district, but obviously understand the challenges that being in a rural area has, both from a funding perspective and on a staffing, to Joe's point about school systems being kind of that one of those primary employers. So I will say this is what you all have described as the reason why this is so challenging. And the reason why we have to have these harder conversations and surface things that sometimes, are hard to hear, hard to say, and all of that. But sit your head in the back and move to the next one.
So what I was thinking is, the minute you get past the state component of funding, that's when it goes wonky. Because if you have a distressed county, if you have a county who has a low tax base, that's where the numbers start skewing. So that has the state considered getting a bigger piece of the pie than what they require of local governments to keep it more equal, maybe them give a bigger piece of the pie, because that's what BEP, that's where our trouble was with that, because fully funding BEP meant 70% of 70% of your people. I mean, it wasn't really a full fund. So why can't they take a bigger piece of the pie to make it something that is livable for everyone? And that burden that goes to local governments isn't as heavy, but they're actually funding education. And I mean, it just looks to me like if they take on the biggest portion, and I know they do now, but I'm talking about the biggest portion, even larger, to where it is more on them, then all of these disparities aren't quite as big. I don't know, I'm just thinking, but.
Certainly, and I would say again that in those conversations, what is captured in a base versus what would constitute some kind of additional weight. I think that is kind of what you're speaking of there, and I do think that is, again, what I'm hearing as part of what they are putting forth. I am not on a subcommittee. I don't do that part, but I would say that that is certainly something that I think will be part of the ongoing discussion as to how that plays out. Yeah, we're going to move on just real quickly.
I'm fortunate enough to serve on one of those subcommittees, and the thing that was alarming to me was that, and others on the subcommittee, is I don't think our representatives and our senators understand the BEP, because they think when they say they fully fund, we gave money to teachers. There's 4 different definitions of teachers in our laws. And you're going to tell me that that teacher in the classroom is not as important as that counselor or that librarian. Once again, well, we gave you this money, and that's my biggest concern. But also now the subcommittees on the base are talking about giving an additional percentage to charter schools. That's going back to what Joey said. You open up charter schools more than that opens up the vouchers. You know, this is supposed to be about public education, but we keep throwing other things in there that have nothing to do with public schools. I understand all that, but we even said the biggest problem with us is that the BEP didn't fully fund. If you're only going to pay for 70% of your teachers, where do you get the local must match so we can get into that? And we know the bare minimum is not enough for them. We know we have learning loss. We know we have all these issues since COVID-19, but we still have not addressed those. And my concern personally is that when it's all said and done, our legislators say, hey, we gave you plenty of money, you didn't do anything with it. But once again, they're not giving us, there's too many strings attached so that we can take care of the issues we need to take care of. If we fully fund, like Cindy's talking about the BEP, that would take care of a lot of problems culture. We can't confuse the word fair and equitable. And it's never, I mean, even in Shelby County, I'm in Millington, I'm in a rural area. You go right down the road, you're in Bartlett, you're in so forth and so on. We have a lot of things going on there, but like I said, in the subcommittee, our biggest issue was that we hadn't talked to board members yet. And with that's who we have to go and talk to get our budget approved. If we start throwing all these things out to them, well, what does that mean? What does that mean? It's going to be very difficult. I mean, we've always been told to have the end, always keep the end in mind. We got it backwards right now. And that's scary too.
Thank you for those comments. Right here, then I have to move on.
This is the first time board members have been a part of any of this conversation. I'm a board chair at Germantown. Have are any of you on a subcommittee as a board member? Not a single board member is on a subcommittee.
I'm not sure. I don't know all the makeup of all of them, but anyway.
I brought this up with the commissioner already.
Okay.
And I think that's a struggle for me, is how do we even know all the things that we need in our budget are being considered in the subcommittees when we're not part of those conversations.
And part of the reason for having this kind of group come together is to do just that. So you can go back to your board.
Again, this is about local. This is about local.
Right.
This is about how to work toward this formula that's supposed to be done in January, February. Then we haven't been included in the conversation, and we're the ones that haven't approved the budget. So there seems to be a disconnect between those elected officials who are making budget decisions and the people who are trying to create a formula to fund said budgets.
Thank you.
We need to be a part of the conversation.
And I would say this, this was part of the engagement that's happening in the town halls. I would strongly encourage you to.
I was at one.
Fantastic.
My whole board did.
What? And see, I think part of this is also, and I had a conversation with mentors at TSBA yesterday. And so thinking about how we continue to work with them as partners. But I appreciate the comment and certainly understand the frustration and appreciate you being here today and being part of this discussion. Okay, so again, thank you all for all of that, and I just don't have a clue.
Yeah, we got 20 minutes.
How much?
20 minutes.
Wow, okay. So what we'll do here, and this is a little bit more about process of, when we think about this formula, I shared that it hasn't been revisited and it's been in place for 30 years. What is the frequency that we should be reevaluating the components? The actual base, the weighting pieces, other updates to the formula. I know I've heard conversations around when do you make adjustments for inflation, cost of living, things like that. What happens in 5 more years when right now we're preparing kids for things that we don't even, jobs that don't even exist yet. So what is the frequency that we should be revisiting this formula, and who should do that? Should that be a state group? Should it be a third party to have a little more objectivity about it? And then what information should inform those decisions, as well as the ramp-up period? We've talked a little bit about that. So I would just say with our time that we have left, I want to make sure we capitalize on that. But maybe we do that in this large group right now. In terms of frequency, what is your thinking about how frequently this formula should be revisited when we're talking about the components that are in the actual formula?
The state part or the?
Yes.
Or the local match?
The state part.
So we're shifting over to like.
Just trying to get some information as we think about what is going to be built. Those of you who've been in this conversation understand that there is a base, and what we talk about things that would be considered for that base. What is the frequency that should be revisited, as well as the weights? Any thoughts on that, Jason?
I think you have to go annually. Every time that the legislature gets together and starts adding in new components and new mandates, I think you have to have that discussion. Now, I know a lot of times they'll add additional components as part of that fiscal note or whatever they're doing, but I think we have to have that annual discussion.
Annual discussion about that. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think you have to do it annually, but also what's important is what's going to be acted upon once we make those changes. Because what will happen is you will come up with things to add to the formula, but they're not being funded. And so, coming up with those changes is one thing, but to actually fund those changes is a whole nother thing. And so you really have to have a plan in place that as these things are going to be reviewed, whether it be about third party or current part, just like DEP, I think it'll be fun.
That's a great point, and I would say that is some feedback we will certainly take back. I've been in the department long enough to understand has to think back to our TIs and the things that we had challenges with. So I think that's a really fair point, and I appreciate you flagging that. Yes, sir.
Steve, I served on the rural small district subcommittee, and a couple of things that we discussed in detail both times had to do with the components and the weights. Who's going to determine what components are part of the weights and what are those extra multipliers? And how that is so much different in districts. They use the example of the district that neighbors me that has almost the same demographic, same number of students, and they have 4 schools within the city, and I have 7 schools within a sparse, large geographic county. So when we start identifying weights, and I'm more rural in that district because of sparsity, how do you determine that? How complex that will be in getting that formula right? And when do I cease to be rural? Because my population grows, or we're also identifying economically disadvantaged. It's one of those multipliers. Well, all you have to do is change what the definition of an economically disadvantaged student is, and your money goes up or down significantly. So the devil's in the details of this, and that's what we're really concerned about, making sure that the right components are in, but also the wage. And And I think it's hard to plan for the future if that weight is considered every year, like, well, I've got a certain amount of money this year, but we grew a little bit, or, you know, components or weights change, are gonna change. You can't plan if those weights and that amount changes.
And I can see the tension between what you just described and what Jason just described, to know that it needs to be something that stays, you know, that we revisit on a regular basis, but also knowing that there needs to be some predictability for you locally to make plans. And so when I think about these things, perhaps when it's revisited, there's a similar ramp-up period to any changes, something like that, that would allow it to be both of those things to be true, that it is certainly something that you're revisiting. As quickly as things are changing right now, it's really challenging to think about how do you do that, but I think that's a very valid point of the need for some kind of predictability, so that you're not worried about if I lose so many students, then, you know, it's going to dramatically change my or something like that.
Very quickly, last point.
Yes, sir.
And when you're talking about the components that you add in, well, we want to be really, make sure the state is really transparent on what those components are, because we get additional funds from different funding streams, or grants or whatever, but it's pretty predictable and reliable. We don't want to give the false impression, oh, we're going to take the safety grants and this other money, we're going to roll it into the student model, and now the piece of the pie got larger, we can give them the school increase. It's not, it could be smoke and mirrors, and I just want that to be brought up as a concern, is that I know the state will all be very transparent.
That would be what I would say. The other piece that has been a very kind of constant part of this is two things. Number one, how do we keep this a very transparent process, but also knowing that kind of at the federal level, there are transparency reporting metrics that districts have to report school level expenditures, federal, state, and local. So there's like a federal piece built into that, but I think just in terms of how we operate, knowing that transparency is absolutely essential for all of this to be successful.
I just want to make one comment and kind of encapsulate some of the other comments earlier, but I appreciate this opportunity, because had it not, I would have very little input on the goings on of this. But as he related to earlier, the most important thing I think we can do is a rural community incentive. We've got to get our legislators involved. If they don't understand what we want, we're not speaking in the same verse, we're all going to suffer. So I think that's probably, paramount is finding out what we want, but definitely secondarily, we've got to hold our representatives and our senators to the fire and get them to the table and let them understand the needs that we have in our end of the state.
I totally agree, and I go back to Superintendent Griffin's comment about levels of understanding and making sure that as we develop a new formula, if we get to the place where the General Assembly passes a new formula, that we educate people on what it actually means and how it impacts schools differently. I do think that people who do education every day have a working kind of knowledge and vernacular about it. Certainly outside of that, it is limited. I do want to make sure that anything else, the other thing I would just flag for you all, knowing that you should continue to think about other considerations that make your district, your communities unique, whether that is now or things that you should be thinking about in the future. Because if you know, and we had a conversation in the back about how do you attract industry to your districts, and knowing that you're trying to continue to grow your community and certainly industry and jobs in your communities. I would just say anything else, other considerations that we should talk about or think about in this discussion on growth or opportunities that may be coming your way. This is kind of like a final consideration thing, and I know we have some wrap up. I'll say it in the wrap up. But anything else that you all can think about that we should try to build in, think about as it relates to changes in local context? I mean, clearly, Haywood's the easiest example right now, but we certainly have industry happening in other places, other opportunities for growth. Are there things that we should be taking into account? And part of that may be the frequency with which you revisit it, it could be impacted by those types of events. Anything here?
I think one concern is, yeah, I have a unique perspective. I was able to be a county commissioner before I became director. We aren't able to tell local folks in Mankato County what this thing is gonna look like in 5 years. I think for all of our rural communities, this is mute. And what we've done with ESSER funds or anything we've got, we've looked at doing things that we can sustain our current operations. And if we don't let those local folks know, I don't want this formula to be something that 5 years ago, when people are walking out the door, it falls on our local folks to make it work. When I've listened to everybody talk today, I think that that's been said in a multitude of different ways. And that point has got to be taken back and told. If you can't tell folks in Mankato County what's going to look like in 5 years, it's not a good idea to do. And that's just coming, we were the little group behind the big group. Trying to think of things that get that in common. Dr. Lee would give to speak. That's a commonality across the board. If we can't tell our local folks what it's going to look like, it's easy. We could have done a lot of different things in Mankato County, and I'm not the director anymore, and how do they sustain it? I think that's got to be a focal point of everything we're doing here today. It sounds great. Folks in Mankato County will take as much money as you want to send us. You know, you can tell us, hey, you're going to get more money. That's an easy step. How we're going to sustain it 5 years from now is a scary dynamic when you're trying to sustain stuff that's going to be beneficial to the education.
Thank you for those comments, and absolutely know that what you just shared, what this group shared, I can assure you will be taken back. I know Sam and I will debrief as well as capturing a lot of those notes as well. Again, as I said, this is all of the complexities that you all have raised are the reason why this is really, really hard. It's also the reason that you really, we really need you to just stay engaged with us and tell us what else is needed. Sam, I'm gonna let you wrap. I can't remember where we're going from here on this. I just want to say thank you again for the thoughtful conversation and feedback that you've shared today.
So first and foremost, I just want to say thank you for the feedback here. It was great to sit with the Haywood team and listen to their discussions around this. Like, this feedback is important. It's helpful to hear. And some of the things that are surfacing, like, we hear the concerns about timeline. I think these concerns about what happens in 5 years and needing to be able to answer that for your constituents is a very big and worthwhile thing to acknowledge. And there's lots of information that needs to be put out there, both about what happens now and what could happen in other models. To Troy's point, being able to explain what this looks like, right? We were talking in our group about fiscal capacity models, and those are complex things that we say, but what are they really capturing, and how well do they capture what's really happening in your district, not just now, but 5 years from now or in the future? How often do we revisit? How do we balance that with stability and predictability? This is helpful. This is part of driving that conversation. So I just want to acknowledge the comments that have been shared today and know that we want to take those back. We want to combine them with the information we hear in other parts of the state, while recognizing that these are truths and realities you all face in your local communities every day too. Like, I don't want to miss that point. There are a few slides in this deck about just capturing some of the summary points of the subcommittees to date, feedback that we've heard. To the gentleman's point earlier, getting a quick digest about what has happened in the subcommittee conversations. Two things that I'll say before kind of clicking over to that. One is that we're going to share this deck out, so it's coming to you guys. You're more than welcome to take pictures of it or anything like that, but if I click through the slides quickly in the interest of time, please know that we will share this deck out with you. And two, what the ask here is in kind of connecting these dots. A lot of you voiced that there's a lot of local stakeholders who need to be involved in this conversation, both on the funding formula side and what the local versus state contribution looks like. We want you to take those conversations back and have those chats with your teams. We will send out the feedback notes, but we want to hear back from you on these topics. What makes the most sense here? Do we have a year delay on this? Do we roll it all at once? Like, does that happen now? Does it happen later? How does that impact decisions so that a recommendation can ultimately be formulated? So I'll reiterate that at the end, but I will click through a few of these again. These are on the distinction here on the formula side, not on the local match side. So just as a quick notion here, so that we're getting up to speed on this, right? This is from ECS, who produces some national landscapes. There are 33 states, once you factor in the 5 that do the hybrid, in DC, 39 total, who are doing student-based models of funding, right? So this isn't something that is kind of fresh out of gate. I do want to tease apart because I want to acknowledge the concerns Joey brought up, differentiating the conversations about the formula piece and then these conversations about choice. I understand their relatedness and the concerns there. I don't want us to miss the opportunity for the money side either. So we just acknowledge that and kind of push that piece. Overall fee factor C, again, this is what the student-based model in theory would encompass, right? Potential components, a base piece that goes to each student, weights that tackle unique things, and we'll talk a little bit about what we've heard to date in terms of potential weights. Direct funding, dollar amounts allocated to students based on specific programs. So think about your ACT retake opportunities, things like that, your AP dual credit courses. And then outcomes, right? Achieving certain goals and what that could mean for additional funding to incentivize programs and districts. Requests, again, I mentioned these earlier, they've been extremely consistent, right? Districts should not receive less state funding than they receive through the current DEP. We have heard that moment, like, well acknowledged and internalized. Requested, maintain flexibility for local district budgeting. I think this was brought up a little bit in some of the other stakeholder conversations that happen around the formula, right? Right now, this is all still about a funding formula, not a spending plan, right? No one is proposing to change that status from the BEP moving forward. So I want to be sure that that's acknowledged, right? You need to be able to maintain local autonomy to make the decisions that are right for you and your community. Third request, ensure that whatever is currently funded outside the BEP is included in a new formula. Sean in the back, I think this was a really good point, making sure there's transparency around that. That's not, a bait and switch, but actually you see how those things get folded in and not just kind of eliminated to the side. One of the things that I'll point out here is that means less e-plan paperwork, that means a lot of less administrative tasks associated with ensuring money comes in and increases flexibility to do what you need to do at the local level. And third, the local match component should be stable for 3 to 5 years. So again, this notion that part of the conversation today, it takes time to think about that. We need to see what the state dollar figures are. We need to see how the formula plays out for everyone before we can make that decision. Again, these were the kind of feedback pieces that we heard from that. In the base, these are going to look pretty familiar to any of those of you who have served on BEP review committees or read the reports. But these are the things that came up. Nurses at every school or at the nationally recommended ratio, counselors, psychologists, teacher salaries and benefits, one principal at every school, flexibility for facility funding and or deferred maintenance. These were just some of those top items that came up universally across the board. It doesn't matter what type of student you have, these things are necessary to serve for a student's education. The weight topics that we've heard the most about bubbling out of the subcommittees and public feedback that has come in to date. Economically disadvantaged and concentration of poverty. And so just so I differentiate that, right now, economically disadvantaged is based on direct certification rates, right? Concentration of poverty may look like something like a Title I school, something that can be externally validated, right? I think that's one piece that has come up about this. is being sure that there's some accountability to knowing what that definition means to the comments in the background. English learners, rural has come up consistently, as well as sparsity, and being able to differentiate that when you think about our counties whose schools are really spread out. That transportation looks different than a county that may be rural, but is small and closer together. Fast growing districts has come up, and charter enrollment has come up, as was identified earlier. As flags, areas that have not received as much feedback, but we had heard originally conversations around. Gifted students, dyslexia, small LEA size, and K2 small class size weights, so for early education there. Again, the subcommittees and the public comment are ongoing. That is not like a full stop. This is still rolling in, being shared with the subcommittees and posted to our website. We'll continue to work on communications and email blast out where we can really summarize that out for additional stakeholders. But want to just acknowledge, like, this is where the feedback is to date, not kind of the end point of it all. Additional dollars, if these were more in that kind of direct piece, financial literacy has come out. Middle school CTE, for those of you who work in that space, you'll know Perkins has recently extended down a little bit. What might it look like for additional funding and the formula to go towards that? Innovative High School Models was an immensely popular grant program that we've used some of our federal relief money from the state level. What does it look like to sustain that over time? Extended school year, this seemed to actually tie a little bit to what was happening around summer programming in terms of how that was being framed. RTI, moving from what is in the BEP that's at a district level lens more to a school level lens. And then high dosage tutoring and what that continuation looks like, especially as some of those other law implications go into effect in the coming years. Outcomes, again, just things that have received positive feedback today. Early post-secondary opportunity completion, AP course completion and or passing, earning industry certs, and work-based learning completion. So metrics that matter for kids in post-secondary support, but as well as what it looks like to be work ready. All right, we won't do this discussion part, but again, we'll share out that deck. I did just want to give that, and again, I recognize that a lot of the requests to date have probably wanted those slides to be at the very beginning of this conversation. What I just want to acknowledge is that part of this was trying to part those things and really focus on this local contribution. It has been heard that having some more context on the front end would make that more meaningful, but don't want to lose the meat of what we really need this group to weigh in on. So in closing, again, our request to you all, take these conversations back to your respective stakeholder groups. Continue to talk as a team. Some of you have identified really strong collaboration points between your local funding entities and your school stakeholders. I know for others that may not be the case, but being able to understand and bridge that gap between these pieces will be really important. So we will send out a feedback form asking you to follow up on some of these points. What makes sense for a timeline? What's important to you about information that needs to get better shared out? And what information do you need to be armed with in order to make these discussions real? Not just what is the state dollar part. We know we got to. We know that part's got to come first. But what else do you need to know? Do you need to hear from Tasser and Seaver about how their fiscal capacities work? More landscapes around how other states do fiscal capacity. What works for Tennesseans, what doesn't, and how does it capture all the unique differences between our respective communities? So we ask that you guys take that back. We'll send out that feedback form and look for you to share feedback with us that we'll kind of pull together from across the state. With that, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Even I'll hang out for a little bit, field any sidebar questions or conversations, but again, we appreciate y'all's time very, very much. You know, it's a big deal. Oh, yeah. No, it's not on there.
But you can go back to the people that maybe didn't register. Yeah, maybe go back to the. It's okay.
All good thing, brother. Merry Christmas, buddy. We know, we get it. Thanks. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.